Hi folks, and welcome to our Wednesday night Lenten gathering. This is a series that started at the beginning of Lent on looking at baptism through the eyes of popular culture. It came to me as I was thinking about a scene where someone was baptized in a movie. The most famous movie baptism scene is, of course, The Godfather. Not exactly what we're looking for. It's a juxtaposition between the sacred act and then the murder that's going on at the same time. And then thus the use of the word Godfather in two different ways. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how movies and television shows have used baptism as a plot device, and not always in the most complimentary way, but the whole point of this is for us to raise questions for ourselves about how do we understand what's essential in baptism and what it means. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to link several videos, or in some cases just tell you where to find it, so you can check out these scenes. The first section is going to be actually whole episodes if you're interested. But then you can pause the video, go to the website. You're already watching this on a website, so just go to the link that'll be on the screen here, and then you can see the clip or the show in question. Okay? So hopefully you'll figure out how that works. That's just how it's going to be, the way we're going to do the video right now. Because we are in week 3, once everything went into isolation, I skipped last week. I said I'd combine some lessons. So this first video actually is going to be a recap. Since more people are going to join us online than we did have in person, thanks for those who were there in person. You're welcome to continue to watch this video, of course, and see if I say something differently, or if something hits you again a different way. But I want to recap those first 2 lessons because they really get the essence of why I want to do this and get the conversation started. So what we're going to do is again, watch a clip, and then I'll have something to say about it. And I want you to think of these questions as you're watching any particular clip. What assumptions or core beliefs does the main character have about baptism? How do other characters see it differently? And what is the intent of the main character? Then, how does your understanding of baptism connect or contrast to theirs? Where is it similar? Where is it different? And how do you think our church's understanding of baptism fits into this discussion? Just off the bat, we're not going to have time to do the hours of work on, we are a church that does baptize at any age, so this is not going to be an in-depth on why do other churches say we shouldn't baptize babies, although honestly maybe we'll turn into that. That's okay. Because some of those themes about what baptism is do come into play, but I'm just saying we're going to operate from the understanding that Lutherans baptize at any age. Real quick primer, in the Lutheran Church we have 2 sacraments. They are baptism and Holy Communion. When we broke away with other Protestant groups in the time of the Reformation, we retained 2 out of the 7 sacraments of the Holy Roman Church, which are maintained still to this day in the Roman Catholic Church. Things like holy orders, which means becoming a nun or a priest, marriage is a sacrament, confirmation, let me see if I can get them all, confession, last rites, which is we call the commendation of the dying. And baptism and communion. So there's 7. All of those are lovely things, but the reason we maintain just 2 of them as foundational sacraments in our church is that not everybody has to do all of them. So not everyone needs to be married. Not everyone needs to go into holy orders. That would be one or the other in that case. Not everyone has the chance to have accommodation of the dying. Confirmation didn't exist in the early church the way we call it a sacrament now. The one controversial one may be confession, whether that ought to be a sacrament. And there are some Anabaptist traditions where foot washing, as we get toward the end of Lent, becomes more prominent, is considered really a sacrament. But we recognize Holy Baptism and Holy Eucharist as the 2 sacraments. They are an earthly thing tied to the Word of God to give us an understanding of the means of grace living. And so that's why those are the sacraments. That's a little primer on our much deeper sacramental theology. So let's get into it. The first video I want you to check out, and this could take some time, because I have 3 episodes you can choose from. I showed a clip from Simpsons, believe it or not. Actually, believe it, there's a lot of Simpsons episodes about religion, and they're like the only family on TV in the 90s that went to church. But that's a whole other day. Season 7, episode 3, if you have Disney Plus, you can access it. I don't have a clip for this. This is where the Flanders family took custody of Bart, Lisa, and Maggie because their parents got in trouble. And as part of their foster care, it was discovered that they were not baptized. And so the Flanders family rushed them to the river for an emergency baptism, which, of course, Marge and Homer got home just in time to thwart. Maybe not my favorite example, but then Modern Family, much more appropriate for the conversation today. It was just this last season. So if you could access Modern Family on ABC, or if you have Hulu, it's season 11, episode 6. Where Gloria has discovered that her niece and the father of the niece's babies are not planning to get the kids baptized anytime soon. So she tricks a priest into coming over after talking to several to do a baptism in private. And then the one I do have a link for because it is on YouTube, All in the Family, a little before my time, but a landmark television event was the experience of All in the Family. It was, if you're younger than me, you may have heard of it. Every social issue was discussed and argued about by this family on primetime television at a time in our country's history that was extremely contentious. And so all the characters are kind of caricatured, but I mean, who isn't on network television, right? So in this story, Archie, who, by the way, is not supposed to be the hero of All in the Family. You all know that, right? Yeah, he's a very bigoted, very small-minded person, but he gets all the funny lines, and there's some charm in Archie and some love in Archie as well, and we're going to find all of those mixed up in this episode. If you go to the notes, you'll find a link to season 6, episode 22, Joey's baptism. So I'm going to give you a chance here to pause and watch one or more of those, and then come back. Just pause the video and come back, and here I'll be. Are people pausing? Are they pausing the video? Okay. So let's pretend you've actually gone and watched 1, 2, or 3 of those. What we talked about in our lesson time together was that in each case, a baby or a young person was baptized in secret or against their parents' wishes. Now, these are all comedies, yet these are dramatic moments in the lives of those families. What is the issue here that made this interesting for me to bring to your attention as a cultural phenomenon? I think there's a problem here, and the problem is that what everyone is doing is treating baptism as if it were on the same level as a magic spell, something that just works all by itself and nobody needs to know about it. That's a very reductionist understanding of our view of baptism. It's a very limited view of baptism, and it really doesn't give baptism the depth and breadth that it should have. And yes, indeed, we as a church do proclaim that as a sacrament, baptism is a sign of God's grace that is not dependent on our action. It's meaning, quote, it counts. This is rooted really in Luther was very, very hardcore about this, very firm about pointing to baptism. The context for Luther was because his church had scared people. Luther saw the people he served as being afraid of their own church, that had made them fear an angry God that was always looking to get them. And so the idea of buying time off purgatory before facing the possible fires of hell, or you go to heaven, or all that stuff was like what people lived with constantly. And Luther countered that by saying, look, are you nervous? Are you worried about God's love for you? Look, are you baptized? Okay, fine, then stop worrying. Find comfort and solace in that. That was not Luther, and that's very profound and important. But in that, Luther is not saying, oh, be baptized and then don't ever worry about your Christian life again. No, not at all. It's an initiation into the church. That's a word that a lot of churches use. And so what I have a problem with in the actions of our comedic actors here is that they're not treating baptism as something to be ongoing or to be in a relationship with. They're treating it as something that you do, and now the contract is sealed, the insurance policy is bought and paid up and all that, and now if something bad were to happen, everything would be okay. That's a really, really unfortunate attitude a lot of people have. I want to share with you just a brief paragraph from Let the Children Come, a baptismal manual for parents and sponsors by Daniel Erlander. I use this book with every family I've ever done a baptismal prep with. It's a classic in the Lutheran Church, and I'd say everybody should have one of these in their house. Just because there's drawings doesn't mean it's not deep. I sound like every comic book nerd right now. More good news. Reformation teachings and teachings inspire the Reformation counter popular misconceptions about baptism. One of them being that unbaptized babies who die go somewhere other than into God's loving embrace, places like limbo or hell. If death comes to an unbaptized infant, we trust the mercy and steadfast love of God. We believe that God gives the gift of baptism for our salvation, comfort, and assurance. We do not believe God is limited by our act of baptizing. We commit all who die into God's tender mercy. I have said before, and I'll say again, if I were the kind of person who believed that God condemned an unbaptized infant to some kind of terrible existence, I wouldn't believe in that God. I certainly wouldn't be a pastor. And so the idea of God's mercy being bigger than our baptism is there not to make light of baptism or to not prioritize it in our life together, but to say that it is not our doing that makes God merciful. And I'm going to keep coming back to those kinds of themes. We must not reduce baptism or anything in our life to a transaction. Religion that becomes transactional, it's easy, it gets in our concrete brain, it's something we can understand, and like an insurance policy or a contract, and yet it's very, very limiting. And in my entire career, I've tried to preach against that kind of thing. I've used the language of transactional theology more explicitly lately, but that's something I want to put out there right now. So at the same time, each of these characters, though, is working out of love. They are trying to do what they believe is best for the child. I might quibble with their understanding of baptism, and I do. However, I'm going to cut them some slack in saying, well, they didn't do a bad thing so much as an incomplete thing. And so that's where I want to say that this is what I've dealt with in my own pastoral life. I think there's some grandparents watching or have been at our studies that can relate to maybe the feelings of an Archie or a Gloria or even the Flanders I love how Homer says that. But the serious thing is that we can fret for our grandchildren when our children aren't taking church seriously. And that's a conversation I've had many a time. However, how I have approached those situations is to say, I will baptize anyone with a sponsor present. And so, not to say even to be sneaky, I'm not trying to say I support that, but that if a parent doesn't want to take a Christian position about something and be part of the church community, I'm not going to beat them over the head. However, if they allow the child to be baptized by the grandparents who take responsibility for them in their formation, then yeah, I baptize. It's not about just who's your parents. So in the irony in the Simpsons clip is that the family who does go to church that never got around to having their kids baptized, they're concerned because baptizing them by the Flanders makes them a Flanders. Well, no, not exactly. But we do use the language of being baptized into the family of God. It's broader than just our individual family names. So that's what I've done. And I've baptized a number of young persons for whom it wasn't necessarily parents standing for them, or I've done cases, to be quite honest, where parents were, but I knew I needed somebody else that would definitely take it seriously. And so I've had those folks on behalf of the church. That's why we use the term sponsor in the church. It's synonymous with godparent. However, godfather, godmother, godparent has those cultural connections like the movie, or like assuming that that's who takes care of your children if you die. That's for your lawyer to talk about. We use the term of sponsorship across the board because it refers to anyone who's responsible for bringing up the child in the faith. More on that in the community aspect in the next video. Now, so again, in all of those examples, there's some nefariousness going on. There's some limited understanding of baptism, but there's still love and there's still a desire. So I try to react to those scenarios by inviting people to be the sponsor themselves, and then they take responsibility. In that All in the Family episode, Archie may be the one demanding the baptism and then doing it himself, and it is a tender moment. But you all know it's Edith that's going to take that kid to church, if anybody. So maybe we look at the community for different roles. That's also a possibility. Food for thought. All right, so let me move on in my notes here. I want to move on now to the second principle that we lifted up in our series, and that was last week. And I do have clips for you, so they're on the page to look at. The first one is from the movie "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" A very fun movie by the Coen brothers, brilliant filmmakers. That was it's probably 10, 15. It's at least 15 years old now. This film. It's a retelling of the Greek epic of the Odyssey. Told in early mid 20th century rural Southern America. So there's a lot of very fantastical things that happen to the heroes of the journey along the way. So just to set that, just a tiny bit of context, these three fellas, each of them with a little different relationship with the law than most folks, are on a quest, and there's going to be all sorts of things, and we don't need to get into their quest, but along the way, they are in the woods kind of trying to figure out what's next, and they encounter a very strange moment that just moves in around them and pulls them to the river. And then a second scene is what follows in the film right after that, as they go on their way and they meet a young fellow who's basically a version of the Robert Johnson legend. Robert Johnson was the founder of the blues, who had played like no one had ever heard, so it was assumed that he sold his soul to the devil and the legend started. So that's where this scene's context comes from. But it's an often quoted scene with the affiliated question. So again, watch these two scenes in order, one, then two, and then what you want to do is think as you're watching it, what are the people's attitudes about baptism? What are other characters countering with their attitudes about baptism? And what do you think of all that? So check them out now. Hit the pause. Am I pausing really good? I'm just not moving. Okay. All right, come on back from watching "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" I really hope you people are pausing and doing that, otherwise I sound kind of like a crazy person on this video. But anyway, an interesting, fun scene, dramatically shot. I love the overhead camera work when he's coming out of the water. I'm a geek for that kind of stuff. But really, what's so exciting there is this these two fellas. They feel there's been a change. They know what baptism is. The preacher just told me all these things. Well, the preacher didn't have time to tell him all those things individually, but he said something about his sins being forgiven. Now, our skeptic in the scene says what's on a lot of people's minds. What about the state of Mississippi? Okay, so you guys can have that. And he doesn't think much of any kind of faith expression, obviously. But, there are consequences. When we talk in the church about forgiveness, we need to be mindful of the reality that sometimes there are people who have been harmed, and it's really not up to us to forgive someone on their behalf. We can talk about spiritual forgiveness. We can talk about, I say to this congregation that sits here on a weekly basis, that your sins are forgiven. Does that mean it's okay to harm a person again or to not make amends? That is not what that means. And so sometimes I do envy, although it would probably stress my mental health, individual confessions. Because a good confession not only gives absolution, but also gives an admonition for reconciliation. I'm using big words. But to be forgiven is to also deal with consequences and to restore relationships. And a baptismal life invites us to that. So, an interesting thing there from Brother Where Art Thou? I share it because it just moving along with my questions and themes. What is baptism, and what does it do, and how does it connect us, and what if we're disconnected? Is going to the river and being baptized and never thinking of it again, what does that do? Does that change a life? Does that change our behavior? Does that deepen our relationship with God? Food for thought. Again, I don't have a clear answer to that. I just want you to ask those questions and think about yourself. But I finally want to get to this clip now that is really my favorite of the lot. And if you, what I tell people is, if you like the film Dances with Wolves, this is the more art house version of a similar story. This is from Black Robe, which is a film made in the early 90s that took place in colonial era, what we would call the colonial era in the United States, when the French were in what we now know as Canada. So you have a priest that is dealing with local people. And again, I want to just do a side teaching here. The Christian church has a tremendously complicated, mostly terrible, honestly, history with what missionaries have done over the years. Mission work has become much more gospel-centric of late, thankfully. But there was a time when, yes, the church was absolutely an arm of colonialism. And we need to get past that mentality. Or if you watch that Archie Bunker episode, you'll see him expressing that in a joking way, and it's really no joking matter. But what you can see here is an example of what evangelism ought to look like. And so I'm gonna save the rest of what I'm gonna say for after the clip. So go to the page and find the link or the embed for the scene from Black Robe. Okay, are we back from Black Robe? Pausing feels weird. So yeah, this is why it's my favorite clip, because it shows the transition actually of mentalities from one generation of the missionary to the next. As the old priest is being replaced by the young priest, the people come to the young priest and say, "Will the water sorcery keep us from getting sick?" That tells you something about how the old priest presented baptism to them. If their context for it is water sorcery. And so, again, if we treat baptism as some kind of spell, then we're selling it short and we're being disingenuous. But if we use baptism as a foundational sacrament that keeps us in relationship with the church, well, now we're on to something entirely different. And so the young priest, he's not going to maintain that mentality. He's not going to keep talking about it as water sorcery. He's going to talk to them about, no, it's not going to solve all your ills. I'm not going to promise you that. But it does connect you to God, and you can pray. And that's not going to just solve everyone's problems and give them all the answers, but it is building community. And then they ask the question that is so profound. After he says, many here want to kill you. And this priest is willing to stay, knowing that. And knowing that, he's asked, "Do you love us?" "Yes, I do." He says, "Then baptize us." That is so profound. In the Gospels, Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter grows frustrated by, "You keep asking me, why do I have to keep answering?" "But yes, Lord, I told you." And every time he says yes, then Jesus gives him a responsibility. "Feed my sheep then. If you love me, feed my sheep." So the leader, the elder that the Black Robe is dealing with says, "If you love us, then baptize us." And so baptism now is something that is a one-time profound moment and does contain all of that power and grace that we speak of, but it's not something that's just done to be forgotten. It's something that begins a relationship. And so Black Robe is now looking at actually having a congregation based not on imposing by trickery or by reestablishing baptism as this talisman, but by making it something to relate to. So that is a model that I'd like to finish on for this session. So these are some examples of how we see baptism portrayed different places. Again, the comedies are going to be maybe a little irreverent for your taste, but I chose them for a reason. Bear with me. We're going to look at some more film clips in the next couple of sessions, and some television clips as well, and ask some questions about the communal nature of baptism, how we do it, things like that. So that's enough for now. I'll wrap up. What I'm going to do, I probably should have done this in the start. I've got water in the font here. I'm going to take water, make the sign of the cross on my head as a remembrance of my own baptism, and I invite you to do that with any water you have at home as well. That is something we can always do. We don't have holy water at the Lutheran Church. This is the font, but we don't consider this water any different than what's at home. Luther often wrote of a daily bath being a sign of God's baptism that we can remember any time. So that's all for this session. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.